Hello everyone, my name is Jen and welcome to the Book Refuge and welcome to another weekly wrap. All right, hello friends. It is time to dive into the books that I read this week. But before we do that, we do have sunlight to deal with. Don't forget that I do have some new designs in my Etsy shop right now. We have the pretty Valentine ones right now, are so cute. These have been super popular. I don't know what's up. I have these cute little zipper pouches that you can use for pencils or makeup or anything. Those ones are on sale right now. Not on sale. They are available right now. But you can always use my code, thebookrefuge10, to get 10% off. Also, if you're a patron, you do have access to a Patreon only code that you can find there that helps you get something extra special off of it. So I also have a new patron to welcome. We have Nicole C, who joined this last week. Nicole, it's so great to have you. I know Nicole has been loving the Outlander read along, and I've had some great interactions with her on the Discord. So it's so great to have you with us. And then we will get into the books because I think I have 9 to talk about today. I think there's 9. Oh, we have 8 to talk about. The 9th one I didn't quite finish it yet, so we'll get to it eventually. So the first book that I finished was a upcoming release called Megan. I'm not sure what it is because to me that says Megan, but like, is it just a different way to spell Megan? I don't know. I haven't heard it spoken out loud yet, but when I see it, it says Megan, so that's what we're going with. But this is the 3rd book in the Loose End series. It has been so many years since a book in this series has come out. Previous ones being Rafe, the Buff Male Nanny, and Zenny, A Marriage of Convenience. This one is a holiday for hire is the subtitle for this one. And it is a fake dating that very quickly turns into a real dating situation mixed up with some spicy BDSM scenarios. So this one is great. Now, I have not read the other series. Well, that's not true. One of the other series that I've read connects in with this one. Actually, the Beards and Bondage series, one of the heroes in there shows up. But I guess some of her, like the gym series she has, mixes in with this. So if you've read those, you may find some cameos. We do also see Zenny and Rafe show up at different times, or at least spoken about. So that's really cool. Zenny is actually very connected with Megan. So Zenny is actually friends with our hero in this one, whose name is Olin, and he is a billionaire. He is on the autistic spectrum, and he is a super hunky billionaire, and he is constantly being, you know, propositioned and people trying to get with him because he's single and hot and all these things. And he honestly is exhausted by it. Also because he's not super great with social interactions all the time. So when he wants women to just like leave him alone, sometimes he comes off as really rude to them, and he doesn't want to be rude. He just doesn't want people hitting on him all the time and trying to get with him. So Zenny offers, why don't you just hire someone? So first there, you know, it's like, oh, could he hire like an escort to be his? But he's like, that, you know, could have damage or come back and look bad on me. We don't know. So Zenny ends up suggesting her friend Megan, who is a kindergarten teacher, but could use the extra money. And he's willing to pay a good amount for her to be his fake girlfriend for a good amount of time. So they end up meeting and they get along actually really well right away. They have some great chemistry. And honestly, pretty quickly, he asked, like, could we make this real? Because, like, I think I would actually really like to date you. And specifically, he's like, you know, I want to keep taking you to these things, but, like, I also want to sleep with you. You know, like, there's that because they have a great connection. And Megan decides to let him in on a little secret that she is actually really big into BDSM. And she is single currently, but she used to be a part of kind of a poly relationship where there was, like, 5 people involved in it. There was some couples that she was involved with. She actually was collared and like belonged to a mistress for a very long time. And these are some of the people in this. They're the ones in other books. So those couples ended up finding each other, and they still will play together sometimes, but a lot of them have settled down, and she's kind of the only one left. So she's a bit of a, like, not a super bratty sub, but she would be a sub. She loves to be, like, overly pleasured. She usually gets rewarded with lots of orgasms, and she's very much into it. Like, she does need BDSM to be a part of her sex life. And so she's like, I don't want to freak you out, but if we were to, like, date seriously, like, I would need you to be into that, or else be into letting me going to do it. And so he's like, well, will you give me a chance to learn about it? And this is actually, it's really cool because I love books where people are getting into the scene. Number one, it's usually always the women that we see getting into the scene. And, you know, part of that just comes with these books are usually written by women and or read by women. And so it's interesting to us when we see them, like, getting into it. But I liked how he was brought into it, you know, first with just some literature for him looking into. She actually is she likes being watched. She's a voyeur. And so there are actually tapes she has of, you know, being with some of her partners. So she gets permission from her partners. Some of her partners don't like to be watched by anyone other than them, but some of them are okay with it. And so she shows Olin some of her scenes that she's done, and you know, asks if, like, is he okay with watching her with other people? Would he be okay with that ever again? Because she does like being with multiple people, but he doesn't want that. But he's like, I think I'd be into watching you with other people as long as I know, like, you're coming home with me, type of thing. So they just start, I don't want to give away, like, all of how it goes, but that's what this book is it's him being brought into the scene and them seeing if they will work and how it goes. And it was just very beautiful. And I loved how his autism is depicted in here, and we do have a scene that it's actually as one of the trigger warnings in here, even though I found it to be just so powerful. It was so good. He does have a autism related meltdown at a certain point in this book, a very, like, important part of this book, and the way that that is, like, handled and talked about was just, I loved seeing that. I really, really did. It was so touching how it played out. So I absolutely loved this. I love Rebecca Weatherspoon. You guys know I love some kinky stuff, and I love how good the communication and the discussion was, and how they experiment, like what stuff he's okay with trying. You know, I love that stuff so much. So this was really, really beautiful story. And Rebecca has said there's at least one more in this series coming, and hopefully won't take another 5 years to come out. But I gave this one 5 stars, and it's a 3.5 on the spice scale. I know that it's a pretty spicy book for that, but my spice scale is relative. Like, there's a good amount of sex in here, but it's not over the top crazy bonkers that we normally get with, like, sex clubs and stuff. So it's more like a 3.5 for me, but I really, really enjoyed this, and I highly recommend, if you already love Rebecca Weatherspoon or if you're someone who loves BDSM, you can start with this one if you want to. It's really okay to do that. Okay, I listened to A Substitute Wife for the Prize Fighter by Alice Coldbreath. This was one of my gifts I got from Megan. This is cool. This is the Toombs Brothers boxing booth. So this book was so interesting, okay? So I was warned, I was told that the first book in this series isn't as, like, approachable or as fun, and I can see that for sure. One of the number one reasons is that the first book, which I've been told was kind of like the author getting her feet in a lot of ways, which is totally fine. We all have to get it somewhere. And it was only really from the heroine's point of view, the first book was. And that made the hero kind of unapproachable to me. I didn't really love him, and a lot of the things that the way that he would treat her, when we don't see his mind and see the context for why he's treating her that way, it just made him very unlikable to me. And he wanted to handle every disagreement with sex. And, like, you know, I love that. But it also does get tiring when the woman's asking you questions and you get mad and then fuck her. But anyway, we move on to this one. So this book is about Lizzie and Benedict. And so Lizzie Anderson is lives kind of with the charity of her aunt and uncle. She's an orphan, and she actually has a cousin whose name is Betsy Anderson, and they actually have the same name, which we'll get around to. They were both named after their grandmother, which is kind of cool. So their names are both Elizabeth Anderson, but they go by different nicknames, right? So she goes by Lizzie, her cousin goes by Betsy. And at the beginning, Betsy has a fiance whose name is Benedict. And he is a, he is an ex-prize fighter, but we'll come back around to that. He's definitely not done with it yet in this book. But he is engaged to Betsy. They're supposed to be getting married soon. And Lizzie and Benedict don't really have a great relationship. She finds him a little bit uncouth and intimidating. He had actually been to prison for something that happened recently, and that is when him and Betsy started like writing letters to each other and fell in love, and he proposed soon after he got out. And he's finding he really doesn't like her family, and not just Lizzie, who like he sees her as kind of stuck up and sees her as judging him, when really she's just very reserved and does think he's a little bit crass, to be fair, but she's a very like empathetic and kind woman, and she does a lot of service work. That's what she does. She's a spinster, and so she does a lot of serving. And where this goes incredibly wrong in the beginning is that there is a luncheon that's happening, and a lot of like local people are there, including the local like parish, can't remember if he's a church or a pastor or whatever he is, but he's there, and she sees that he's stolen something. And while they're at the dinner table, you know, she hasn't like said anything about this, but she's seen that he's the one who took it, and a maid starts getting accused of it. And she looks over at him and is kind of beseeching him to say something, and he won't. And she can't see this maid get fired, because she would be fired without a reference. Her life would be ruined. She'd probably have to turn to prostitution, like all of these things. And so Lizzie speaks up and says that he stole it. And even once they search him and find it, they still try to prove that he didn't. Like, her family completely is like ignorant of it, and it's just like, no, you're a liar, Lizzie, you need to take that back. And she refuses to retract her statement, and so her family disowns her and kicks her out of the house for sticking up for this maid. It's so sad. Now, at the same time, Benedict sees the way that this family acts, and he doesn't know that she's been disowned yet. But he sees this, and this is kind of the last straw for him. He really fell in love with Betsy through the letters, and just thought that, you know, he wanted a wife and she would be a good one. And now that he's seen what her family's like and sees her character, where she's not willing to stand up for her cousin or for this maid, and he's just like, no. So he breaks off the marriage and he leaves, and he decides he's going to go back to be with his brothers, who are in a traveling fair, which we'll get to in just a second. But before he leaves town, he actually ends up running into Lizzie, and she has ended up having to get a job. Like, right away she's able to find one, but it's a really tough job for her, and it's not something she's like done before. And he's like, I'm gonna marry you. The banns have already been read for me to marry an Elizabeth Anderson, and your name is Elizabeth Anderson. So she's able to just like steal her cousin's, you know, the marriage license that was for them, and they end up getting married. Of course, there's more discussion going on, but we're trying to move it through this explanation. But anyway, he feels a little bit of like selfish glee that he gets to take this woman who he thinks is a little too stuck up and thinks she's too good for him, which of course she doesn't think that. He just is assuming, because that's who he is at the beginning. And he's going to do a final season with his family, which is in this traveling fair where he works in the boxing booth. So there are all these different, you know, acts that are there. There is fortune-telling women, there is freak circus acts and all these things, and they have to stay in this tiny little moving wagon that really only has room for their bed inside, and they're like forced into these close quarters and everything. So this then is kind of a slow burn between this couple who married for convenience, and really he does save her from the workhouse or it being even worse than what it could be. And I loved this couple. I really, really did. The things that I loved more about this one than the first one, number one, is we get the hero's POV in this one, as I stated. Makes it so much easier to know what he's thinking and to see like what he is misinterpreting. And I loved watching them slowly learn to communicate, learn to, when they're having an issue, come to each other, which isn't what happened in the first one, and just watching their love bloom for each other until he realizes that, you know, he didn't really marry her for convenience at all. He liked the kind of woman that she was, and he wanted her for himself. So really enjoyed this one. I ended up giving that one 5 stars. It's a 2 on the spice scale, and I highly recommend the series. If you do start with the first one, which honestly, you don't need to. These books aren't connected in the sense of like, oh, it's all about a set of brothers or all about like, you know, a group of friends. Like each book is only tangentially connected. So like we hear reference to Will and Minnie. We hear them referenced, and then the next one is supposed to be about a theater company, and we hear that guy referenced, but none of the 3 are really like related. So you can skip right to this one if you'd like to. And I mean, I don't know, maybe you'll like the first one. That one was cool too, but this for me was, I mean, I loved it. Okay, next, I finally read Sophie Surrender, aka Surrender. Okay, so Surrender, which has this cover, is done by is getting re-released on February 8th. So this was first released, I think it was like, it was last year, early last year it was released. And Sam Mariano is re-releasing it. She said she didn't change any part of Sophie and Sylvan's story. Nothing has changed. But when Surrender comes out, there will be a 15,000 word edition that will catch us up to date with what's happening in the other part of the Coastal Elites, because the crossover in this one's actually set in college, and the relationship between Sophie and Sylvan is super intense. We'll get into that, but Sylvan is friends with Dare, so this one takes place, you know, it's a little further past the events that happened in Even If It Hurts. And now Dare and Aubrey are going to college, and Sylvan and Dare know each other, let's say, and they have minds that work a little bit similarly, we should say. So Sophie goes to a Halloween party where she catches the eye of Sylvan, and Sylvan wants her, and so he ends up getting her alone with him in a escape room, and he sexually assaults her. Like, let's call it what it is. He sexually assaults her and decides that he wants her. And so when she escapes, she's like, oh, I got away from him, I'm never going to be alone with him again. Wrong. The man goes for her and goes hard, and he ends up like soft kidnapping her for a weekend, bringing her to his home to convince her to be his. And what's really freaky about this one is that usually in Sam Mariano's books, the parents aren't like too involved, but in this one, Sylvan has some parents who are very like, well, his dad is just as manipulative as him, and he actually like threatens that if Sophie doesn't decide she wants to be with Sylvan, like things won't go well for her. So like there's a lot of pressure. So yeah, and then near the end of this book, kind of the final act part of this, is where Dare actually helps Sylvan with a certain situation. So we see Dare a little bit, and Dare is there to scare Sophie a little bit. So yeah, again, another toxic relationship, super bonkers, very intense, but as with most Sam Mariano's, it was so hard to put it down. Like, it was just so addicting. So I ended up reading this week. Number one, it was just, I don't know, I just really wanted to get into it. I crave Sam Mariano books sometimes. And yeah, I read this one, and because when Surrender comes out, I want to skip right to the 15,000 word part of it. So because she said, she's like, didn't change anything about this. All of the editing and things she did were for that 15,000 words. So now that I've read this, I am up to date, and when that comes out, I can skip ahead to that and find out what's going to happen with Hannah and what's going on with Dare and Aubrey and everything. That's what I'm going to do, and we're going to see what's going to happen next, because holy shit. But I gave this one 4.5 stars. I do think that I don't know. Sylvan isn't my favorite Sam Mariano hero. He, of course, has a lot of the aspects that we adore so much from one of them, but he just didn't fully click with me. And also, I think the bigger thing, because, like, the guys are always a little, you know, they're unhinged. Sophie needed a little more backbone for me, if I could say that. I needed her to be a little bit like willing to get on the mind level with him, and like she kind of does. Well, I mean, she does by the end because it does have an HEA, but I just wanted a little more of her trying to like manipulate back, because that's what I love about a Sam Mariano heroine, is when once she figures out the hero's game, she is able to play it to get what she wants out of it. And that's what I was looking for. But still loved it. This was a 5 on the spice scale for sure. For the trigger warnings wise, we do have, you know, unprotected sex, dub-con, non-con, kidnapping, threatening of the family, and birth control tampering. And then for kinky side, there is anal, spanking, breath play, and breeding kink. So all the good stuff. And then from one psycho to another, we have God of Malice by Rena Kent. This was, of course, a reread. I was not planning to reread this book. Let me say that. One of my patrons did choose this for her book, but when I read this last January, I keep bringing that, it's been a year since I read this, I annotated this while I read it. I did it for a vlog, I read this and did it. But I was just wanting to see the beginning of this series again because of how so many of the couples, as we will read through as you go through the series, meet each other in this one. There's a particular night that happens and there's a lot going on. And I just wanted to revisit it and have it fresh in my mind. Also, because this patron, she was probably going to pick, she's going to pick the rest of the books in the series too. So I wanted to like reread this one and annotate it a little bit more. I added some more notes into it because I'm going to be doing God of Pain next, so I thought I would. So this book is the first in the Legacy of the Gods. This is a spin-off series, a second generation series for Rena Kent. You can start with this series if you want to. I definitely did, but there is a whole backlog of everything if you want to get into that as well. This is about King's College and the Royal Elite University, which are in the UK and not far away from each other. I think it's in the UK, yeah, and not far away from each other, and they're like rival schools, and there's like clubs in each school where all the bad boys are from, but they're from like the wealthy to-do people, which appears to only be mafia and billionaires and stuff like that, but that's the world we live in. And so for this, we have Killian Carson, who is the son of, I have it saved right here, who's the son of Asher and Raina. And then we have Glyndon King, who is Levi and Astrid's daughter. And another reason I wanted to reread this is that Landon and Brandon, they just had books 4 and 5 in the series, and I wanted to revisit them. And boy, I'm glad I did, because there's hints at stuff in this one, especially Bran. There's a few moments that Glyndon will say, like, she notices him, like, pulling his hair in a scene. So, not to spoil everything, but Bran has self-harm tendencies that he relies on. And when we get into his book, we go through all of it. But there's moments in this one where there's a stressful situation, and she notices he's, like, he puts his hand through his hair and he's like pulling his hair. And so there's these little things that I picked up this time. But anyway, this book starts off with a face fuck. Gotta love a book that starts with this. This is literally like, because Untouchable starts that way, but Sophie Surrender also starts with a face fuck as well. So a non-consensual face fuck. Although, as I've said before, with God of Malice, things are not always what they seem. And Glyndon isn't completely a reliable narrator for saying she doesn't want certain things. That doesn't mean that Killian still doesn't push things too far, but she is at the edge of a cliff thinking about a friend who recently unalived himself, and she was supposed to do it with him. It was a unaliving pact, and she didn't do it. And so she feels like a failure and that she let the guy down because she didn't do it. So she's contemplating life. Killian is a photographer, and he comes across her doing this, and he actually is going to push her over the edge and is like, what are you going to give me to bring you back? Because he's like, I'd really like to photograph what it looks like when you hit the ground. Like, the screws are wiggling around in there for sure. And she is like horrified, and he's like, oh, so you do want to live. You just needed someone to push you a bit. And he ends up being like, what are you going to give me if I let you live? And she's like, nothing. And he's like, not the right answer. And he's like, I want you to let me use you, and then I'll let you live. So he ends up forcibly taking a blowjob from her in exchange for her life. So that's how these two start out. But he ends up not quite being done with her yet. One face fuck isn't enough. And then not only he finds out she's a virgin, now he really wants her, but also her being whose sister she is and all that, like, he wants her. So he begins stalking her and trying to make her his. So that's what this one is. This is a stalker romance. It is dark and it's not for everybody. But that one is a 5-star read and it is a 5 on the spice scale for sure. This one has non-con, dub-con, talk of suicide, suicidal ideation. Be prepared for that. And then some of the kinks in this one are breath play, somnophilia, cockwarming, and breeding. So it's got the good spicy stuff. Alrighty. Next up is Nocturn. Thank you, Mel, for making me a cover for this one. This is by Skyon of Kushel. You will need to go to, this one is on fanfiction.net. So as always, I'll have the link down below to the fanfiction. This one's on fanfiction.net. And this is a Snamini. So Hermione and Snape. And this was one that had a very promising beginning, but I'm honestly not going to go into too much detail because it ended up being 3 stars and it was so confusing. I don't even know how I'd explain it, but the very basic of it is that it appears that Voldemort has won. Snape, who was on the side of the Order, you know, all the way up through, we have him, he had killed Dumbledore, but like he was working for him. And something goes wrong where it gets messed up. And so he, like, Voldemort wins. So now, instead of reveal himself to the Order, who never knew that he was on their side and would probably kill him on sight, he's forced to continue working under Voldemort, even though he never wanted to be. He wanted Voldemort to be defeated. Now he's stuck on his side. So we begin from his point of view, him being forced to work with him. And he ends up, through some machinations of the Dark Lord, whenever there's like a celebration, they all meet at this brothel, and one of the prostitutes there, her name is Nocturn, and she has a bodyguard. Every one of them has a bodyguard, and he usually has to like just find a girl there to fuck and then get out of there, but he is very drawn to her, and so they have a night together. And he really liked her, even though she doesn't speak, her bodyguard doesn't speak, she's always silent. There's just something about her. And so he ends up continuing to go back to visit her. Now, one of the things that I'll say without saying anything, but I'll saying something, this book said that it was a Snape and Hermione. So when he's falling for Nocturne, I knew, and this is just saying it because of what the fic was, I knew Nocturne had to be Hermione somehow. But she's described as having black hair, purple eyes, and nothing like Hermione at all. But it isn't Polyjuice Potion, and it is, so you don't know what it is. So the part of this book that was super cool is that he's falling for Nocturne, and I'm like, well, it's a Snamini. So unless Hermione's just gonna pop up out of nowhere, like, the woman he's falling for has to be Hermione. But you don't know how or why or what's going on. That is just all that I knew. So this one isn't too terribly long. I do think it was still interesting. I just got a bit bored because once the reveal of like us figuring out, you know, how Nocturne is the person we want her to be, I was not very clear about how we took down the Dark Lord, right? Because of course we end up winning by the end of this, but their plan and how it played out was the most convoluted thing that I just was so lost. And so this was one of those that had such good potential, and I love that. But I got very confused by it by the end. So I ended up giving it a 3-star, and it was like a 2 on the spice scale. It really wasn't. I mean, this one was rated mature, but on fanfiction.net, mature can literally mean if there's even like kind of closed door sex all the way up to erotica. Like, it could be any of it. It's not as delineated as like AO3, but it was intriguing. I just wished for more from it. I really did. I wished for more from it. Okay, next, there was The Wrong Bride by Katarina Mara. This is the Patreon exclusive read of January, so I will not be talking about it in this, but if you are a patron at the $7 level or higher, you will have access to this review, as well as all of the 19 previous books that I've reviewed, so definitely check that out. I just filmed the review of this before this one, and boy, did I have some thoughts about this one, for sure. That was an arranged, or like a arranged marriage type book. Next up, I read Bride by Ali Hazelwood. This is another one that comes out the beginning of February. And even though I have some January and February 1st ones to read, I wanted to read this. So I did. It was calling to me and I wanted to read it. So one of the things that I had to say is I've been calling this Ali Hazelwood's like Omegaverse romance. It's really not. I mean, not from what I can tell of this. It's more just, it's a paranormal fated mates. For some reason, I got it stuck in my head that this was Omegaverse, and maybe I did see that somewhere, but there aren't alphas and omegas and betas in here that I can see. There are alphas because there's werewolves, you know, like there's an alpha whether there's like, you know, the Omegaverse going on. So this was a paranormal fated mates, but it also starts with an arranged marriage between a vampire, who is Misery, our heroine, and a wolf named Lo, who is an alpha for a pack of wares. And in the beginning of this, Misery is chosen to be the collateral. She is familiar with being a collateral because she actually has done it before, not for wares, but for humans. She was the humans' collateral against them because she's the daughter of one of the higher up vampires. But now she's being forced into this marriage with Lo. So she marries him and then she has to go live with the wares, and there's a vampire who goes and stays with them. She doesn't have to do an arranged marriage, which was kind of annoying to me, but she goes to live actually with, or are they married to each other? I don't know. Raven has a twin brother. Raven? Jesus. Raven is the heroine of The Wrong Bride. Misery has a twin brother, and the were goes to stay with him. So I think that's what happened. I don't know what the beginning of this was. So anyway, she's partnered with him, and now she's having to live in this home. They're not sharing a room. She's seen as a complete enemy. There's some of the wares try to kill her at different points, which would cause a war with the vampires, which would be very bad. So we need her to stay alive. But anytime someone attacks her, she ends up getting yelled at, which was kind of annoying in the beginning of it. It really was. But something that made it work is Ali Hazelwood struck a good balance with the heroine for me. She was just enough snarky, just enough like self-aware, just enough like, you know, of a vampire badass to like ride this line of like, I liked her a lot. She could have been too sarcastic, but I think for the situation, it worked for me. And then this is a slow burn between them. Now, she has a bit of an ulterior motive for agreeing to be this collateral. She has a friend who is almost like a sister to her who has went missing. And there are some clues that one of the wares might be connected to the disappearance of her friend. So not only is she supposed to do this because like the vampires need someone to volunteer for it or be it, but she also wants to know more about what happened to her friend. So there's all of those layers to it and everything. And then, yeah, it ends up being a slow burn with her and Lo. And this one is a fated mate. And I think the thing that, I don't know, made me think that it was Omegaverse is like, he does have a knot, but there are a lot of werewolf stories where he has a knot. That doesn't have to be Omegaverse by any means, but it is a fated mate, and it is one where like they're not fully aware of like what that means. So there's that. And I was really enjoying this. Like I said, I liked the world building for a good amount. I think that this is very approachable for people who maybe don't read a lot of paranormal. You know, and since it's Ali Hazelwood and she's pretty, you know, popular at this point, I understand why we played a lot of that with a bit of a lighter hand. I think if you're an old pro at paranormal, you might find some parts of this pretty boring. Like, that's the thing for me. Like, the fated mates part of this is so obvious to me from the beginning right away. I'm like, oh my God, yeah. He knows that she's his fated mate. There it is. Because I have read more than one paranormal book in my life, right? But I think, you know, we take for granted the stories that we really love and that we know the tropes that won't feel like that to other people. So you got to have a little bit of wiggle room for that, you know? But I was really, really enjoying this. It did have a very, very slow burn, which I was prepared for. Okay, and when I'm about to say what I'm going to say, it's okay that the slow burn was there. It was. What I didn't love is that this book had a white fang happen, which is totally apropos, it being a werewolf situation. And it was a white fang that was so unnecessary. Like, it's so unnecessary. They're literally a married couple. What are you white fanging her for? Like, they have this beautiful sexual encounter, and she's being vulnerable about something, and he is like, put up the wall of China between us. And I'm like, no. So this was going to be a 5-star, and it dipped right near the end for me. But again, I liked the heroine. I liked the hero. I did. We don't get his POV. This is a single POV, except the beginning of each chapter has a little sliver that is third-person POV of the hero. So you get some ideas of what his brain is thinking. Like, you get to see little snippets, but we don't get a lot of his. The setup for the next book looks good to me, and I would read more of these from her. I just think have lower expectations if you are a lover of paranormal, because there's a lot of things that are done very simply, and that's okay. It's okay. And I hope that people read this and want to read more, right? The absolute best scenario to me is someone reads this, likes it, and then, you know, shows up at one of my videos looking for fated mate recommendations, right? Like, that is the ultimate goal for me, because then we can lead them to more. So I ended up giving this one 4 stars, and it was a 2-ish on the spice scale. Like, it's hard to say. There's some, when they have the sex, it was really good, but it was a very slow burn, which may be good or bad for you, depending. All right, then the last book that I got through was another reread, and this was the Madest Obsession by Danielle Laurie. I read this for a patron. This is book 2 in the Maid series, I believe, yeah. And this one is about Gianna and Christian, and this was one that I'd forgotten a lot about this book. I'd read it so long ago, but Gianna is, you know, one of the typical, like, women in the Cosa Nostra, where she is married off to someone who's much older than her. And in the beginning of this book, she loves her first husband. She's kind of infatuated with him. You know, he's the one who she gives her virginity to. But he takes her for granted a lot. He cheats on her all the time. And so she loses that love very quickly for him. Then, not too far into this story, her first husband dies. She gets passed off to another husband. And, you know, that one dies eventually, so she's supposed to be pushed on to a third one. She's just supposed to keep being forced to marry them until, you know, until she dies, basically, is what she's supposed to do. Then we have Christian Alistair, who is actually a dirty Fed, and, like, we know that right from the beginning, and he does work with, like, he works with the Bureau, and he also works with some of the mafia at the same time, so it's a weird relationship there. And when he first meets Gianna, which happens way earlier than we think that it might. This book, the first half of this book actually spans like 7 years pretty quickly. Like, we see how Gianna has ended up at kind of this jaded place that we've seen her in, like, the first book. And she's just very, like, worn out with all of it. And she does drugs sometimes. She drinks too much, which honestly, like, who could blame her for what? She has no choice in her life. She's just supposed to be used as a vessel for the Cosa Nostra, you know? And Christian has always had his eye on her. He has, and he kind of hates that he does, because he doesn't want to care about anyone, but he kind of becomes her shadow without even meaning to. And so for years, he keeps an eye on her and wants to protect her even against his own will, type of thing. So this is a very, like, slow burn between Christian and Gianna, and there is a lot of, like, there's some hate sex in this one. There's a lot of, like, insults that get thrown back and forth, but it's really beautiful. Also, Christian has a very tragic past. We have some trigger warnings for sexual assault of a child, abuse by a mother. He goes to prison when he's very young, so there's a lot of rough stuff he's been through. We get some knowledge of that, so be prepared. As well as Gianna has some spousal abuse that we see, alcoholism, as I said, and drug use at different points. And then, yeah, oh, and Christian also has OCD, and we see him struggle with that and live with it in some different scenes in here as well. So I gave this 5 stars upon my reread. I really enjoyed it. I liked it more than I ever remembered, and it's a 3 on the spice scale. So there you go. That is the books that I read this week, which was a good amount of rereads, actually, but some new ones as well. So thank you so much for watching. Of course, don't forget to check out the Etsy shop. Get you some cute protection for your Kindles and your books. And yeah, check out the ways to support the channel if you so desire, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye.